thank you for joining us this morning at this event to commemorate the 30th anniversary of German reunification, which fell last Saturday, the 3rd of October. I am very grateful to the British-German Association for jointly hosting this event today, and especially to our distinguished panel of speakers for giving up their time. Before focusing on events of 1990, I would like to say how important the UK-Germany relationship is to me and to the whole of the UK government. We are close partners on so many issues, and just recently we have worked together throughout the coronavirus crisis on repatriating each other's citizens and on funding vaccines. We're in regular contact on Iran, on Hong Kong, Russia and other shared international challenges, and we enjoy a deep and important friendship. In diesem Sinne heißen wir auch unsere Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer aus Deutschland herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie dabei sind. The Germany of today was forged following reunification in 1990. This was a pivotal moment, not just for Germany, but for the world. Our speakers will provide personal reflections on how they experienced reunification at the time and what it has meant for them and for all of us in the following 3 decades. I think back to watching the events on the TV at that time, but personally I also recall working here in the Foreign Office in the Diplomatic Service and going on a German course pre-reunification and spending some time in Bonn, and then later when I studied with the Open University, actually, I spent some time near Weimar, and that was post-reunification. So a little bit of experience and a few reflections that I personally have, having spent time, I suppose, on both sides of Germany, on both sides of the wall at different times, and I'm sure many will be reflecting on the events of that time and on events since then. But I would like to now introduce our panel. First of all, Lord Waldegrave, who became an MP in 1979 and was Minister for Europe from 1988 to 1990, and thus at the forefront of the UK's response at the time. He went on to serve in several cabinet positions, is Provost of Eton and Chancellor of the University of Reading. We also have Anne McElvoy, Senior Editor at The Economist. She too had a ringside seat at the momentous events of 1990, reporting from Berlin on the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the events leading up to the reunification. She has also lived in East Germany as a student and wrote a seminal book on East Germany entitled The Cow, which was published in 1992. And I'm also delighted that we are joined by Andreas Michaelis, the German ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was previously State Secretary of Germany's Federal Foreign Office, and naturally his career has been shaped by the events of 1990, which began to unfold just after he joined the diplomatic service as a trainee. We really look forward to hearing your memories of the year of 1990, your thoughts on the role of the United Kingdom and other countries that they played at the time, and on how the events of 1990 have changed the world in the following 3 decades. To everyone who is joining us online, I say a big welcome. Please note that you can see a facility on Zoom to ask a question. Please do use this. All I would ask is make it clear if your question is for a particular speaker. That would be of great help to me. And we will try and cover as many questions as time permits. So first of all, I'd like to turn to Lord Waldegrave.
Thank you very much, Minister, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel to reflect on these extraordinary events of 89 and 90. I say 89 and 90 because I think it's impossible to consider the reunification of Germany without understanding the popular impetus behind which led to the fall of the wall itself and the extraordinary scenes that people like Anne were lucky enough to witness on the ground the year before. Now, a small correction which has a little historical freight with it. I was not called the Minister for Europe. I was actually the Minister of State with responsibility for East-West relations and security policy and POSD, and also minor things, Africa and the Middle East as well. But it's worth remembering that Europe meant Western Europe then. So it fell within my area of responsibility because I was responsible for dealing with Eastern Europe and with the Soviet Union. It's just an interesting reflection backwards. And it reminds us that there were two different things going on at this time. And it depended which was more important, depended on which you looked at. One was the huge popular upsurge all across the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe and in Eastern Germany itself, which led under the tutelage and under the care, and he's out of fashion now, but one should never forget him, of Gorbachev, who told them that it wasn't told his soldiers and his predecessors, henchmen, that they weren't allowed to put down these movements by force. So that the whole movement of freedom across Czechoslovakia, where I spent time, Poland, where I spent time, even poor Romania, Bulgaria wasn't at all sure that it wanted to escape from the Russian Empire, at least its elites weren't, and so on. And East Germany, where the upsurge of reunification. Now that was one thing that was happening, freedom reasserting itself and self-determination reasserting itself. The other thing that was happening was the end of the formal end of the Second World War. In that, the four powers still had legal rights over Germany and over Berlin, and the processes of dissolving those legal rights, which of course to the youngsters, and you three are all youngsters, you were the people lucky enough to be on the ground seeing it all happen. I was watching from ministries. But they all seemed irrelevant to you. The Four Power Pact and so on, and the Potsdam Agreement, what was that? That was surely from the past. But there were those who were very, very concerned that the procedures for dissolving those legal agreements and those treaty agreements should be properly followed, not least the British Prime Minister. Now, the British Prime Minister had various concerns, some of them respectable and some of them less respectable. Her most respectable concern was that nothing should be done to undermine Gorbachev. She feared that, and it wasn't a foolish fear at the time, it's easy in hindsight, but it wasn't foolish at the time to think that if things went too fast, that Gorbachev might be undermined. And incidentally, if it hadn't been for the astounding self-discipline of the German people in East Germany, it easily could have gone wrong. If they had started to throw stones at Soviet soldiers, if they had followed a violent course, it could easily have spun out of control. I'd love to hear Anne's perception of that from the ground. It didn't, partly because of the self-discipline and extraordinary self-restraint of the German people. But it was not foolish to be anxious about Gorbachev. Then she had what many people, including myself at the time, thought were less sensible worries. Stalin, of course, long ago had offered a unified Germany in exchange for the neutrality of Germany, by which he meant that the Soviet Union would infiltrate it and it would be very difficult. And so she was worried, and I wrote a furious minute telling my boss, Douglas Hurd, to be braver about telling her this was all nonsense. She was worried that a unified Germany might go neutral. Incidentally, there was art even about the word unification and reunification. Reunification to some people meant reopening the Oder-Neisse line. And what about East Prussia? So that careful people in Germany in particular used the word unification. Now, and then there was her anxieties looking forward, and she had these famous seminars at Chequers where historians were sent for, that she thought that a unified Germany would be so preponderant in the European Union that it would take the European Union in ways which were antipathetic to her idea of a sort of free trading bloc, which was what she thought of as Europe. And that, in a sense, was encouraged by the very honorable, to me, and extraordinarily, in a way, self-deprecating in this respect, leadership of Helmut Kohl, who always said, Germany united is a big animal, but it'll be fine because we will integrate it into Europe, and that will make it safe. I mean, to talk about your own country in such a sort of humble way, in a way, was remarkable, I think. And he meant it, and so did many, many other Germans, both left and right in those days, that it was safer, that the great big preponderant 70 million people Germany wouldn't be a threat to France or Britain or Italy or anybody else, because it would be within the institutions and the integrated institutions of the European Union. Now, of course, Mrs. Thatcher didn't care for the integrated institutions of the European Union at all. And then I have to say, and I say this carefully, because that she was of the generation, the post-war generation, who got much more sort of, it'd all been brought up on silly comics about the Second World War and so on. They hadn't fought in it, they hadn't been there. The people who had been there, like Lord Carrington or Lord Jellicoe, or in different ways, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, were all passionate pro-European Union people. And not anti-German. My famous headmaster, Robert Burley, who set up the educational system in the British zone after the Potsdam Agreement, they were passionate pro-Germans in the sense that they knew they were rescuing the aberration of Germany and taking it, and underneath it lay the Germany of Goethe and Fichte and Schiller and all the rest. And that's what would come to the fore again, which has come to the fore again. So, but the next generation down had the slightly more sort of cliched, oh, who won the war sort of attitude. And there was a little bit of that in Mrs. Thatcher, I'm afraid. So she was stirred up by Francois Mitterrand, who was partly also nervous about the reunification, but also loved mischief. And also, it is not known in French diplomacy to spend a little effort dividing the British from the Germans. And he came up on one famous occasion and said to her, "It is autumn 1913, Margaret." And off she went like a firecracker. And then he would go off back to Helmut Kohl and say, "Do you know what dreadful things Margaret was saying?" And he was a little mischievous. Then there was the problem of Genscher. Now, you don't have this problem, Minister, at the moment, that when you have a very able and very charismatic FDP man leading the Auswärtige Amt, and a very deeply embedded CDU chancellor, you weren't quite sure who was giving you German foreign policy, which can sometimes complicated the issue. I kept very closely in touch with Horst Teltschik in the Federal Chancellery Office to make sure we knew what Kohl was thinking. So we missed the boat, actually. We on the reunification in the early days by appearing to begin by dragging our feet, by putting obstacles in the way of what was inevitable and good. This had been British foreign policy, NATO policy, Western policy since 1952, and it was a triumph. And to be leading with Gorbachev, somewhat encouraged by Mitterrand, a separate policy against the committed policy of the British government was foolish and put us out of court for a time. Douglas Hurd and good Foreign Office officials, doubtless you, Minister, as a young official, put us back on track again with the 4+2 discussions, in which the British took a leading and honourable part, and that was appreciated in Germany. But I think, overall, as opposed to the rest of Eastern and Central Europe, where the British government was firmly on the side of right, and Thatcher was often a hero, rather to the alarm of people in Britain, some people in Britain, we didn't get it right in relation to the German for a time, but and it left some damage, I think, which was repaired with the help of very, very good German friends then and now. But it did leave some damage, and it's very nice that in one sense relations are as warm as ever they were again, but in another sense, of course, some of the seeds of, I declare I was Remainer, some of the seeds of the subsequent growth of extreme Euroscepticism perhaps derived from steps around the time of German unification. Perhaps that's enough for me.
Thank you, Lord Waldegrave, and thank you for an absolutely fascinating insight into some of your time here at what was then the FCO. I'm going to now turn to Anne, and I'm looking forward to, Anne, you sharing with us your experience and your take of events at the time. Anne. No, I can't.
You're still on mute, Anne.
Anne, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I can now. Sorry, I think I was muted. Both of our apologies.
Thank you.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Thank you very much, Wendy. And I'll take us back, if we could, not least because Lord Waldegrave remarked rather kindly that we young people were on the ground then. I don't know if you can see that, if I heard it on camera. This is a Sunday Times magazine piece I wrote a couple of weeks ago. And here is my press card. Let me see. Does that make sense?
Wow.
That is my press card from East Germany in 1989-90. As you can see, it's all very much hand typed up, and I do have a lot of hair then. Anyway, so it's all hand typed and then, of course, diligently copied to the Stasi. So a little bit my prehistory really for 1989 become fascinated with Germany long ago, and the reason, which Ambassador might sort of also find interesting when we think of how Germany sort of taught itself in Britain, was I love German, I wanted to do German at Oxford, and the textbook that we had on Germany Today, one of those completely sort of tedious A-level textbooks, had about 9/10 of it about the Federal Republic. It was total Bundesrepublikanisch, you know. And then at the back end, it had this little bit going, and there's this other bit, and it's all very silent, all communist, and there's a wall. But it was very, very undetailed, and I got very fascinated to explore that. So I specialised as much as I could in East Germany, and I was lucky enough to win a scholarship when I was at Oxford that would sort of fund me to go and spend a lot of time in somewhere off the grid. One year at the end of the first year, and I chose Ilmenau and went to the Technische Hochschule, which was sort of trying to style itself as the MIT of East Germany. That was a bit of a stretch, but it did educate a lot of the technical elites in East Germany, and therefore I also was very lucky and had fortunate experiences, and ended up being with my peer group, but a lot of whose parents, I have to say many fathers, because it wasn't, feminism was a wee bit skin deep in East Germany. You were in sort of key positions, so I had ringside seat from early on about what was happening, and that I went back then to the Humboldt University for a year in 87, 88. So that was collectively a really fascinating time. And it's not for nothing that you get those sort of Deutschland 83s and Deutschland 86. I was there 85 and then 87, so not far off. Because the mood was simply this, and I had friends from very loyalist families, I had friends in the opposition, was that it couldn't go on as it was, but nobody knew how it could be different. So you had sort of slightly wild kind of policy ideas like Finlandization, in which somehow, which I still think is a really interesting thing for sort of future doctoral students, because it's a mindset that shows how both East and West Germany, East and West, as in Lord Waldegrave's sense of being sort of diplomatic outlook, and policymakers couldn't really see what to do about this divided country. And to be on the side that said, well, I think the wall will fall, would have put you absolutely out on a limb. And I think we should remember that when we look what we now call black swan events, or things that we think could never happen, which shape the world. So to that extent, it was, I know that there are a couple of people close to the Pentagon who always claim they predicted it. I maintain that only my friend Burkhard Kohlmüller, who lived in Leipzig, predicted it, because he was a green activist, and he was very sort of on the ground and involved in and he said, everything's wrong here. He said, we're falling behind in the technical race that we need to be in. They'd all been at this university, so they saw themselves as the technological, I should say, elite. And he said, we're falling behind, and computerization is just going to go like that in the West, and we'll be here. And this gap was so big, it's going to be existenzbedrohend for us and threaten our existence. And then he said, and anyway, look at this place, it's falling apart. So he just had that sort of this can't go on feeling. And this, I think, that really clarified my view from early 1989, when the first free elections took place, that it was more likely to go badly wrong than not, although that still was not, I think, fair to say, most of the diplomatic analysis was that Ostpolitik would meander on, but nothing big would happen. And of course, as we all know, what happened was the Hungarians sort of got involved and also decided, in the sense of trying to use Gorbachev's freedoms, that they had sort of had enough. And once you started to interfere with borders, and this is something that's a lesson I took, in this case very positively, but sometimes for good and ill, because I also covered the fall of Yugoslavia and the wars that followed. It was once you started to have any uncertainty about whether the borders were absolute or not, or if you said to people you can't travel, that they find ways to travel, then these states, which didn't really have public support, will rot very quickly from within, much more quickly than I would have thought. So 1989 happens. It was, even by the standards of the fast events of that year, extraordinary. Turning up at Günter Schabowski's press conference. Schabowski was really one of probably the two Politburo people that I knew quite well, and he was funny. You know, he was the big sort of working class Berlin guy who'd ended up as the party boss. He still used to tell me, he used to say, we're both journalists, and I used to go, yeah, but Günter not so much really, you know. And he said, yeah, but you know, I ran Neues Deutschland. He was a Ratchik. He believed in the system. He had a very amusing Russian wife who brought her parrot with her from Moscow, and she clearly, it was very interesting, she was very close to Gorbachev and to Raisa Gorbachev, and she looked down on these German, she said, these are not people of the first garderobe, which I was always a marvellous phrase. So they really were sort of fairly, you know, mediocre, gone to seed, and that the Gorbachev developments would test them. And as it turned out, so 1989 was an extraordinary year. It all happened as fast as you can imagine, to the extent I ran down to the wall after the press conference and said to the Grenzer, you know, to the guys sitting in the, you know, the first ones you come to get in. I had my little pass. The wall is open, have you heard? And they simply didn't believe it. And it's also very interesting, there's that excellent book by, I think his name is Marie-Elise Sarot, on what actually happened minute by minute and putting the archive back together. Is it really the evening news? Everything went quiet for a few hours. Nobody knew what to do. And that's also a reminder, isn't it, how, you know, the Lenin phrase about sometimes, you know, epochs can pass in a day, and that's exactly what happened. I know you want us to talk briefly about 1990, and I've got about 3 minutes left, or 3 or 4, so I will say I echo largely the way that Lord Waldegrave remembers it. Seeing it from the other side, the 2+4 talks, I've just taken part in a documentary for German television about it. I think absolutely right that we ended up in the wrong place. I do think that Mrs. Thatcher, sometimes the presentation in Germany today, where there's a lot of you crazy Brits thinking around, and sometimes I feel actually German diplomacy doesn't do much to gainsay it, perhaps as much as it could, that Thatcher was very loyal to Gorbachev, and she thought he would get left behind by this. I think, whereas there's a rather odd thing to say about Margaret Thatcher, but it was her late phase. And as all, I think everything culturally that Lord Waldegrave said about her and her limitations on Germany, I agree with. I think she really what she didn't foresee was that Helmut Kohl, who had also, of course, rightly lionized, but was also playing a fast one. He got up in the Bundestag and said, here's a 10-point plan. And then he said, oh, by the way, it'll soon be a 2-point plan. And then he said, it'll be something a bit that looks like the Federal Republic. It was a brilliant segue. But it was also, and I think very much sort of largely missed, that this meant, and it was Telchik who drove it. It was Telchik who said, get on board with this and unify this country, because, yeah, that's the way to go. And I think what happened was that sense that Gorbachev would be saying, well, what happens to me? Margaret Thatcher was trying to shore up her relationship, which gave her importance with Gorbachev and that international significance. You know, she was saying, man, I can do business with, and all that, you know, good stuff. And that this was being undermined. Certainly Mitterrand, I completely agree with that, and had a great fun looking through the Kohl archive. It's very, very funny if anyone has this kind of nerd interest in how much Mitterrand basically played both ends and said, you know, this was, it had to be held up and they must make common cause, and then, but of course this has been written out of the French diplomatic account, and very charming and I think very able ambassador in Berlin was just telling me that Mitterrand had always been on board with unification. I thought not so much from what I'd read. The side who got left behind, we haven't touched on, well, what happened to the very brave, restrained East German opposition who went on the streets. And of course they divided inevitably between those who were more left-leaning and those who were more, as in the Angela Merkel came from this quarter, more conservative, more right-leaning, and would quite happily go in with the CDU. And I was very friendly with the Foreign Affairs Advisor to de Maizière. So he was in the room and he was inspired. It's funny because you had these 25-year-olds who suddenly, with the roommate, who was sort of, wasn't really allowed to be a course he wanted in East Germany because he was Christian Democrat, sort of. And the next minute he's in the room, alongside the 2+4. So to that generation, they were hoping, and it's very odd because they were rather left-wing generally. Not my friend, but there was a lot of them who are still critical to this day, come from the left of the spectrum. They wanted it held up so they could try something else. And it's one of those little moments in history that ends up on stage quite a lot, when there was a desire in certain quarters to try a confrontational crisis, which was not going to be, it's your usual, neither Washington nor Moscow sort of, can we have a bit of socialism, a bit of capitalism? Personally, I think it would have been doomed by demographics and people simply moving and going towards the West as the economic powerhouse very, very fast. But there was a sense, and there still is, in quarters and certain demographics in the East, and not small ones either, or that this all happened too fast. It happened to a timetable that Cole imposed. So strangely, there was a bit of sympathy for Margaret Thatcher, perhaps trying to put the brakes on it. I only mention that, and I know I must hand back over to you, because I think sometimes narratives emerge that miss out those sort of granularities, and I think there's something there that has led a bit to the rise, not only but contributed to the rise of the AfD, and the fact that it wasn't as easy to glue the two Germanys back together consistently as we might have hoped back in 1990.
Great, thank you, Anne, and I appreciate you sharing with us your reflections and your experience, and it really did feel like in your contribution just now that you were still sitting at the ringside as you were talking and telling us it through your experience. So thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to the German Ambassador Andreas Michaelis, who I'm sure will share with us his reflections from his perspective. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for hosting this event, and thank you for having me. I should start by saying, following on what Anne said about her German book, that it was so very much Federal Republic of Germany. When I started to learn English, my textbook in the 60s and 70s was very much Tom and Betty. Tom and Betty were the two characters in the first book, and it was totally UK centered, and the US only came into the 3 or year 4, and Australia, India, if I look at a modern textbook, it's a totally different situation, only entered relatively late. So I grew up, and I've asked myself during these days of the unification celebrations, which were different this year, I would say, more relaxed, more self-confident, as far as the internal union is concerned, but also as far as the position of Germany in the European context and environment, and I dare say even in a global dimension are concerned. There was a different tone this time, and I think for the first time people could fully see the achievement that is involved in this incredible task, which we couldn't complete ourselves, but did with friends. But I asked myself, did I really grow up in a divided country? Objectively, that's certainly true. And I still remember that, when we opened our atlas in school and we looked at the maps of Europe, we had Polish occupied territories. We had Soviet occupied territories indicated on the maps where we were taught. And that this was still used in the 70s after the Warsaw Treaty, after the framework agreement, the Grundlagenvertrag, that was signed between the GDR and the Federal Republic, which is quite amazing. And add to it, because that's important when you come to the point how I experienced 89, the fall of the wall, that I served in the German army in the late 70s. Everybody served in the army except conscientious objectors. And I served almost 2 years in a nuclear artillery unit in the late 70s. I mean, that's something that is totally forgotten. The idea was we were based in Hanover with our battery, but we would have joined British forces at the Porta Westfalica, which was in a way the other western end of Germany. And there we would have fired 1 kiloton grenades on German soil in order to stop Russian tank units that were, you know, fast approaching through the very flat northern plains of Germany. So this was a bizarre, in that regard, a very bizarre reality in which you grew up. But your mind, I think, you know, a fair description would be, was totally absorbed by that reality of the Federal Republic of Germany. We had no relatives in the GDR, so we didn't travel there. The only, you know, kind of daily reminder that there was another Germany was that sometimes when you switched from one channel to another, you ended up watching GDR television. And I think I can say for many Germans of my generation, there was certainly not this emotional feeling that, you know, let's say in the year 88, in the year 87, we are, you know, desperately awaiting German reunification. That is why in 89, when things accelerated, when things suddenly changed so quickly, as we see today, very much a peaceful revolution of the other Germans and other people in Eastern Europe, that we had to basically come to terms with that objective reality that suddenly, historically, had to be managed. And not just, you know, by those who were responsible politically, but over time, as a society, we simply had to absorb, in a way, that reality, which was the reality of a divided country, and see how we would fit together again with our brethren on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So from that point of view, I had just returned from the UK. I was a student for 3 years in this country. And in May 89, I joined the Foreign Service. Here I was in Bonn. Nobody expected in May 89 that in November, the wall would come down. And it was a relatively, I think, slow moving summer. And then things really accelerated because of Hungary, changes in Hungary, etc., etc. We had the question, of course, of East Germans ending up in on the soil or on the territory, protected territory of German embassies in Eastern Europe. Prague is a famous example, and this had to be handled. And the unit in Bonn, in the foreign ministry, that was the elite unit, and you had to salute these colleagues every morning, you know, was the unit which officially was called Germany as a whole. Germany as a whole. Because that was very much, you know, they were dealing with our representation in East Berlin. They were dealing with all these delicate questions, complicated legal questions of how you dealt with the other German state that wasn't, you know, 100% recognized, but somehow recognized by us. And that very much, I think, shaped German foreign policy during that summer. And on a personal note, they sent us to the south of France to improve our French language skills. And that's when the wall suddenly came down. And I had three colleagues who had lived in Berlin. And one evening we watched the news. We saw people dancing on the wall as it collapsed. And Bernauer Straße, suddenly people could cross again. And the next morning, they suddenly left this language school. They said, you know, permission, yes or no, it doesn't matter. We go to Berlin. We want to be there. And they managed to catch an early train, and they arrived in Berlin on the evening. And this turned into, you know, I will never forget, into a fairly exciting object of disciplinary action in the ministry. Lower levels of the hierarchy felt this was totally unacceptable what had happened. Fortunately, at the end of the day, these three were rescued by the political level, because everybody understood that emotions can suddenly, you know, in a historical moment, tempt you to go that way. After this, a crucial period, which is often overlooked, started, and that's the period when there was an independent government in the GDR. Don't forget, they held elections. Suddenly they had a new minister president, for the first time a minister president, and they had a foreign minister, Marcus Meckler, who established diplomatic relations with Israel. The first country with which the newly independent, as it were, fully independent GDR established diplomatic relations was the state of Israel. And France, they even established a GDR embassy during that time, a new embassy with a new ambassador, a young student of theology who became ambassador at the age of 30 or 29 in France, who is now the head of the civil service, the equivalent in Germany. Things, you know, really developed in a very, very fast way. You know, I want to share maybe just two political points. I think one is very important. Our way of conducting diplomacy was, and I put it diplomatically, very limited at the time. You know, we were taught at the beginning to look to our right, what is the UK delegation doing? To look to our left, what is the French delegation doing? And then look straight into the eyes of the Americans, and suddenly we knew what to do, right? That was very much the German way of conducting foreign policy. But in the 90s, in the next 10 years, I would say, it took at least 10 years until we even started to be able, you know, to deal with foreign policy issues at the professional level we should deal with. That's where we learned a lot from our colleagues in the European Union, and first and foremost, I would say from our British colleagues, because I think we admire the professionalism of the British way of doing diplomacy. And today, and that's, I think, also an achievement, we can conduct China diplomacy, we can be part of the E3 on Iran. So we have learned a lot, but the style of our diplomacy, I think, is very much shaped by the experience of the first steps of Ostpolitik in the 70s. We love to move slowly. We love to be mainstream. We love to check again and again as we step forward. So sometimes I can understand our colleagues can't stand it anymore because we are so slow. But on the other hand, that is what has made also the success of German reunification possible in a foreign policy dimension, in a dimension of European policy. The other is the question of our identity. I think if you ask Germans today, and I want to end with this, how they would describe their identity, there is a very small minority of people who have a critical attitude towards Europe. But the vast majority, I think, would rather describe a twin identity, a nation-state identity, somehow combined with a European identity. And that is certainly also what distinguishes us, let's say, you know, as I believe, from people in the UK, that we have a hybrid identity on top of a hybrid political reality in which we conduct policy. So it reaches, in our case, further than just a constitutional environment. It really touches on that very question of identity. And if you want to take a Eurocoin, the Eurocoin, I think, is describing that picture. On one side, you have the denomination, it's €1, it's €2, all across the Eurozone. But on the other side, you have the King of Belgium, you have the symbols of the French Revolution or the Brandenburg Gate. And I think this kind of welded identity is something that is unique, and where we as Germans believe we just will continue by having, basically these two platforms on which we stand, and it is the two platforms that have made German reunification possible.
Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing with us an insight into what it was like growing up in a divided country, but also so many other aspects of your work and the approach and the evolution of German diplomacy. Now, the questions are coming in thick and fast, so I want to see if we can get through a good range of them in the time that we have left. The first question I have is to Lord Waldegrave. And that is, you've described how the UK position evolved and became more supportive. Was that ever under any question, or was it ever challenged? Lord Waldegrave.
Well, it was a development why I was so frustrated in the early period when Thatcher was taking the most obstructive position, really, was that I thought the British foreign policy was always pragmatic. That the great thing about British foreign policy was you looked at reality and said, how can we best handle this for the British and other sensible interests? We got into trouble with the Americans for recognizing Red China before they did, and so on and so forth, because it was there. Now, what annoyed me was, I thought, and actually, here's a little point that is relevant to the future, why I think I got slightly more clarity that this was going to happen and was inevitable, and that to be making all these slightly legalistic points, even with the Gorbachev point, which is a real one in the background, was that I was talking to the youngsters. I was talking to people of your generation who were on the streets. Now, if you only, with all respect, Ambassador, talk to ambassadors, ambassadors at any one time are always going to say that the regime to which they're talking is a very, very important regime and is going to be there for a very long time. And you had to talk to the youngsters in the embassies who were out on the streets in the evening, and the journalists, to see what was really moving. And therefore, I was frustrated by Thatcher getting herself in an unpragmatic position. It changed with great skill by good Foreign Office officials, good leadership by Douglas Hurd and his officials. I saw the name Stephen Wall coming up on the questions there just now. People like that who got us back in the game again after the Ottawa discussions, and we did contribute in a positive way to the 4+2. For those who are not familiar with that, that was, of course, that there were some saying this is all the matter for the four, the post-war four to settle. And I think it was partly the British who put forward to the Americans the idea of saying, well, let's say 4+2, both Germanys. And that was a sensible, pragmatic move. So it did change, and no long-lasting damage was done. Can I just tell one anecdote to reinforce the point that all of you have made about how fast it was going on the ground? You know, in the summer of '89, I was in Berlin, and there was an incident. A boy from East Germany swam across the canal, got his hands onto our side of the canal, which meant that under the rules of the Cold War game, he should have been safe, but he wasn't. The Stasi came in a boat and knocked him off and took him away. And I made a fuss because I was there, not actually at the canal, but I was in Berlin. And I was sent for by the Social Democratic, pretty decent man, Social Democratic, Momper, West Berlin, Momper, who said to me, look, you know, you don't go grandstanding about this. The wall's going to be with us for 30 years. And we've got this lawyer who gets them back in the end, you know, and it'll be all right. Don't make a fuss. You know, we have to live with this situation. Anyway, I was too young and silly and made a fuss. And actually, they sent the boy back. No credit to me, but credit to good work by our diplomats. But there was an intelligent man saying, we've got the thing's going to be with us for another generation. You know, go carefully. So it was, in some ways, it caught all the leaderships in all directions by surprise.
Thank you for that. I'd now like to, Ambassador, ask you a question. You spoke quite a bit about colleagues and diplomacy. Do you still have a sense of which of your colleagues come from the East and which from the West?
Today, among younger colleagues, you know, when I was State Secretary and we were discussing the question of who we promote and who we would take in and how many we would take in, it didn't matter anymore, really. You would not even have indicators that would tell you where these people came from, except the place of birth on a piece of paper. But when I joined, it was a crucially important question because I joined in '89 and then '90 formally reunification happened, and then '91 it was a question of the next intake of diplomats and what would we do? Would we recruit in the former GDR? And to what extent would we recruit? And Genscher took a very tough decision at the time. He said, I'm not recruiting anybody who ever worked for the Ministerium für Auswärtige Angelegenheiten of the GDR, on the basis that they were all members of the party, and he wanted to make up for it because he saw it as a very tough decision by saying that starting in '91 we will take 1/3, roughly the size of the GDR in the reunified Germany, 1/3 of all applicants, and those that take will come from the former GDR. And he actually fulfilled that promise by taking these people. And in the early years, I think it was very clear backgrounds were so different, and you could see, you know, it wasn't entirely clear how we would grow together. But today, when I look back to the colleagues that joined us in '91, '92, '93, you know, I think we are a very homogeneous lot these days.
Thank you for that. And now I have a question for Anne. Anne, I wondered if you could say a little bit more about feminism and it being skin deep in the GDR. We know the position of women in Germany is often discussed both before and after reunification, but I wondered if you could share a few thoughts with us on that.
It's a great topic, and obviously it's become rather more fashionable at the sort of university level than it was when I was around. I mean, these are my personal reflections, really. I mean, it was a funny place that way, because in one sense, because you had on paper much more aggressively sort of Gleichberechtigung der Frau, you know, this was a part of the East German constitution, but the East German constitution, like a lot of Soviet modelled constitutions, didn't reflect the full reality. And I think if you can usually tell a bit, if you look at the top downwards in politics and who makes decisions and holds office in societies, it's a reasonably good guide. And the only woman who got into Politburo was Margot Honecker, and she was married to Erich Honecker. So, you know, that's obviously wasn't necessarily a route for most people. And therefore, really, the people that I dealt with who held those, you know, the big factory managers, the people who were sort of really supposed to be powering on this kind of East German economy, which by Comecon standards wasn't bad, but as my friend had rightly diagnosed, was falling behind in the age of partly because of computerization, but also simply could not innovate fast enough, and it couldn't keep a lot of its good people were still trying to get out. So I think feminism sort of suffered, in a sense, from being, it was a great aspiration. It's very much reflected in a lot of German literature. My own person I wrote a lot on is Christa Wolf, and her struggle, and actually, which is still my Desert Island book, is her book, it's called Nachdenken über Christa T. In German, it's a sort of quest for Christa T, which is about the death of a friend, a fictional character, but it's also another side of herself. It's the more assertive, less scared, more challenging, including to the ideology of East Germany. And I think that shows that there was this sort of pent-up demand, and young women had a great sort of sense of themselves. They're often very sexually quite liberated. They had reasonably, you know, they had a lot of those sort of on paper rights, but what they didn't really have was the roots to influence the society, or indeed to at all be challenging about gender roles. I also remember you got one day, I think it was a day a month, for household chores but that was for the women. There was the idea that, Mr. Honecker might take a day off and clean the fridge. Not so much. So there was that. It was a very multi-layered society that way. Also interesting as a young researcher I know who's done a lot more on gay rights and the evolution of sort of thinking, which was still very, very repressed, really largely when I was there, or sort of hidden. It is, you say, again, it's a multi-layered cake, in the sense you'll find areas of freedoms that have been claimed, but you would not find that it was something that wasn't discussed, and it was certainly not discussed in news and current affairs openly in the East.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you again for sharing with us your thoughts around feminism. I'm conscious that we've had a range of questions. I know there are many more questions that people would like to ask, and alas, I know that we're always limited to time on these events. So what I'd like to do is just ask each of our panelists to maybe just give a couple of minutes of reflections, concluding remarks, to share with all of those who have joined you on this call today. So I will turn to Lord Waldegrave first.
Well, thank you. There's so much to say. I would like to re-emphasize two people who have mentioned. One of the people who became rather a friend of mine, Oscar Nemeth. I think the Hungarians have, their opening of the border with Austria was a crucial moment. And I think it was brave of them to do that, and they deserve to be celebrated for that. Television came up, and I'd love to hear more. But Anne mentioned stumbling on the GDR television, but surely one of the solvents of the regime in the East was the fact that the East Germans could plug into West German media all the time. It's noticeable that regimes, totalitarian regimes, always try and suppress media. The South Africans tried to stop television and so on. And so the pull of Western culture. But I remember too, because I have some literary interest, much less well informed than Anne's, but there were moving voices in East Germany saying, don't let's lose it all. There is something that is worth preserving of community and so on, which produced this wonderful spectacle of Mrs. Thatcher and Gunter Grass being allies for a time, which was very surprising. And I remember that. But I also remember, and let's not I just remember the sense of joy and the sense of success for Western policy in the end, that by staying stalwart and people like Ambassador Michaelis as a young soldier having to do the appalling things really of contemplating war on their own land with short-range and medium-range nuclear missiles. Fottel, follow on to Lance, was a crucial episode in all that, where there are going to be nuclear missiles on German soil and East German soil and so on. But the triumph of the stalwart behavior of the West Germans, of NATO, should be celebrated, even if things went somewhat wrong afterwards. My goodness, they could have gone wrong worse. We should celebrate Gorbachev, but we should celebrate the discipline of those people in East Germany who didn't do the things that could have caused catastrophe.
Thank you, Lord Waldegrave. Anne, a couple of minutes from you.
Good, thank you. I think I look to the future and say I'm very pleased that you put this together today, because it symbolises something I think we need to do, and I think we need to do a lot more, and in a more self-critical, if we can't talk about sides between Britain and Germany, but in both quarters, a bit more self-critically and a bit more energetically. We need to reinvigorate this British-German relationship, not to put too fine a point on it. And E.M. Foster had this great phrase, the Victorians looked at the relationship between Britain and Germany as awkward cousins. And I think we have been through a period of awkward cousinage, and I think it's still there. It's there in the wake of the Brexit vote. And when Lord Waldegrave rightly talked about a generation who grew up perhaps with a sort of who won the war, slightly suspicious mentality, which a lot of us very much wanted to get over, to gainsay, to find out much more about how the relationship between our countries and how it would evolve as we and the fantastic events that we've been recalling. I do worry a bit about a mentality of who's winning the Brexit war. I worry about it diplomatically. I worry about a sort of a kind of grumpiness, which is notwithstanding the rights and wrongs of Brexit, the difficulties of delivering on that deal, if the deal ever gets delivered on. Maybe the ambassador could just give us a little hint. There's only about 300 of us on the call, so like no one. But you know, these are very, very important things. But whatever happens, we are incredibly important partners. I think in the sense of having, in values terms, so much more in common than we have apart. And we really must, I think, be very wary of allowing the aftermath of something which mattered an awful lot, and it mattered an awful lot to the kind of people who care in the elites about Britain and Germany, but we will, I think, allowing it perhaps to become a bit too bad-tempered. And I also would look to new leadership, frankly, in Germany. I think that will change. You know, I think we got a little bit stuck, and not surprisingly, and we haven't talked about her enough, but very great presence of Angela Merkel on the global scene, but we are coming to the end of that. It needs a reboot. It needs a reboot in Berlin. It needs a reboot in London, because I think there is so much that also threatens us, and security and relationship attitudes to NATO in Germany, and also slightly, are they aligned or still aligned with us? I don't think whether we should still be frenemies. You know, I think if we want to be friends, we have to find the territory on which we are going to remake this relationship. So I feel I've been a bit challenging as we've all looking back to a time, but the 2+4 talks, you know, were a diplomatic Meisterwerk, a masterpiece. And I think it just reminded me, writing and broadcasting about them, that when we can do a lot, even with very, very different interests, but we have to be very determined to put our minds to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And now I'd like to just turn to Ambassador for a couple of minutes of your last reflections.
Thank you very much, Minister. I would like to stress one point that did not so far figure in our discussion, and that is that if you look at reunification, if you look at the two Germanys, it is also important to look at the, let's say, criminal dimension of German history. Because especially for the West, the role of Germany in the 20th century for the West German state, that was a crucial period, and through, let's say, a re-education program, suddenly in the West, democracy was established, democratic institutions were established. But I think because we regained sovereignty in 1990, not everybody was entirely sure how the Germans would use their newly regained sovereignty against the backdrop of that history in the 20th century. Maybe we just mimicked, you know, the kind of responsibility we spoke about. But I think, you know, we can now see, and those who lived in Germany, that it went very, very deep into the foundations of the German society and the German constitution, and that today, even after reunification, because that was a different process in the GDR, the country is very much shaped by that responsibility, which comes from the role which we played in the 20th century. And it is only now that we allow ourselves, because we're also sometimes invited to take and accept leadership, to accept leadership roles. And maybe there has to be, you know, on the basis of the confidence that we can trust ourselves, there has to be more responsible German leadership, but very much in a European dimension. And one last thing, I think what makes it possible for us to play a positive role in Europe at the moment, and that has to do with recent developments and a strong constitutional foundation in our country, is that we are not really divided. When I look at Western democracies today, many of these democracies are deeply divided. Yes, we are being challenged also by populist movements, but if you look at the mainstream of German society and German policy, that is not a divided country right now, which is important because we were once divided, but 30 years later, I think, we put all the glue that was available to us to bring the parts together and create, you know, a kind of new balance, which allows for, let's say, a policy that would have made probably people like Ernest Bevin who were working for that kind of Germany in the initial phase when the German state in 49 in West Germany first became a reality, where they would have said, yes, you know, the way it looks now, that's exactly ideally the kind of thing we were aiming for.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to all of our three panellists, but thank you to everybody who's joined us on this event today. I certainly feel that we've been privileged to learn about the events of 1990 through the experience and the reflections of our three key speakers, and through your experiences and your being part of history. And I think this has really reminded us all of just how important those events were in shaping our continent and our world over the past 3 decades. And so once again, I'd like to thank the British-German Association, everyone who's attended today, and in particular our three speakers. Now we will have to finish now, but I would like to wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you, and Auf Wiedersehen.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks so much for hosting us.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, all.